Alright, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Chapter 7, The Story of Nirvana, Come As You Are. David Eric Grohl was born on January 14, 1969 in Warren, Ohio, to James and Virginia Grohl. His father was then a journalist for the Scripps Howard newspaper chain, his mother a high school English teacher. Dave has a sister, Lisa, 3 years older than he is. The Grohls left Columbus, Ohio and moved to Springfield, Virginia when Dave was 3. When he was 6, they divorced. My mother and father were pretty much at other ends of the spectrum. He's a real conservative, neat, Washington, D.C. kind of man, and my mother's more of a liberal, free-thinking, creative sort of person, says Dave. He says the divorce didn't affect him much, perhaps because he was so young at the time. Dave was raised by his mom, whom he adores. She's the most incredible woman in the world, he says. She's so great. She's strong, independent, sweet, intelligent, funny, and she's just the best. Raising 2 kids on alimony payments and a schoolteacher's modest income was hard. There were tough times when we'd eat peanut butter and pickle sandwiches for dinner, Dave recalls. As a kid, Dave appeared professionally in a Washington theater company, but his main love was music. He formed a little duo with his buddy Larry called the H.G. Hancock Band when he was only 10. They'd write songs and Dave would play a 1-stringed guitar while Larry banged on pots and pans. Dave started playing guitar when he was 12 and took lessons for a couple of years. He'd write songs about his friends or his dog and play them into a boombox, then play the tape back over the stereo while he recorded the drum parts back onto the boombox. Eventually he got sick of lessons and just played in neighborhood bands doing the typical Rolling Stones and Beatles covers. Dave hadn't yet discovered punk rock, although he'd already gotten a taste of new wave from the same B-52's appearance on Saturday Night Live that Kurt had seen. He had gone out and bought the requisite checkered vans as well as records by the B-52s and Devo, but nothing prepared him for the time he visited his cousin Tracy, who lived in Evanston, Illinois in the summer of 1982 when Dave was 13. Something I wanted to add real quick about the prerequisite checkered vans, and that did sort of come with the new wave era. Kurt, who really couldn't afford the checkered vans, would draw squares on his shoes and on his guitar. Now, I'm not saying that a teacher's salary isn't crap, because teachers definitely do not get paid enough. But a teacher's salary plus alimony payments, you would be capable of financially taking care of 2 children, no doubt. Especially if you're buying brand name vans. What I'm suggesting is Dave Grohl's idea of poor is a lot different than Kurt Cobain's idea of poor. When Dave and his sister Lisa came to the door, Dave's aunt called Tracy downstairs, and Tracy starts coming down the stairs, and she was totally punk, says Dave. Bondage pants and chains and crew cut, and we were like, wow, Tracy's punk now. Tracy took Dave and Lisa to punk shows all that summer, seeing shows by bands like Naked Ray Gun, Rights of the Accused, Channel 3, and Violent Apathy. From then on, we were totally punk, says Dave. We went home and bought Maximum Rock and Roll and tried to figure it all out. Punk agreed with Dave. He liked just being a little punk shit running around town and being a little derelict, he says. I suppose that was half the attraction, being a slacker. The other half was the extreme energy of the music. I was super hyperactive, Dave says, although not hyper enough to get put on Ritalin, like Kurt. The solidly middle-class people of Springfield were more tolerant of punk rock than the folks in Aberdeen. Dave always had good, cool friends. He was popular enough to get elected vice president of his freshman class at Thompson Jefferson High School in Alexandria, Virginia. Before he did the morning announcements every morning over the school intercom, he'd treat the whole school to a little blast of the circle jerks, or bad brains. That's interesting. You remember the kid back in high school who used to do the morning announcements? You had to be pretty charismatic, and you had to have some confidence to speak to all your classmates like that. So Dave had been on a microphone since he was a little boy. Like Krist and Kurt, Dave was a stoner in high school. I smoked too much pot, says Dave sadly. That's the only thing that I really kick myself for doing, because it seriously burned me out. Bad. From the time I was 15 to 20, I smoked 4 or 5 times a day, and a lot, every day of my life. You just get so burned out. You don't feel burned out when you're smoking it, but once you stop, you realize, oh, I lost something here. Pot began affecting his grades, so he and his mother decided that he would attend Bishop Ireton, a Catholic school. Meanwhile, he had decided that the drummer in his bad punk band, Freak Baby, was so lousy that he was going to play and play better. He'd sit down at the drums and bang around a little after practice, but most of his self-education on the drums came the classic way. In his bedroom, Dave would pull up a chair for a hi-hat, a book for a snare, and his bed for tom-toms and play along to music by hardcore bands like Minor Threat, DRI, and Bad Brains. When they kicked out the bass player in Freak Baby, the drummer switched to bass and Dave switched to drums. They changed their name to Mission Impossible and played fast hardcore punk, so fast that they eventually changed their name to Fast, which broke up around 1986. Being a suburban stoner, it was only natural for Dave to get into Led Zeppelin. It was even more natural for him to start copying the classic licks of Led Zepp drummer John Bonham. I used to rip him off like crazy, and then I figured out the weird stuttered kick drum in Kashmir, and that opened up a million new doors, says Dave. You take pieces from other drummers, and like the drummer from the Bad Brains to John Bonham to the drummer from Devo, and it eventually becomes this big mush, and that's me. Just one big ripoff. Yes, Dave Grohl uses a lot of John Bonham. Trust me. And I'm actually going to be making a video about how Dave Grohl uses a lot of John Bonham. After Fast, Dave was in a band called Dane Bramage, instead of Brain Damage, that mixed hardcore punk with the sounds of adventurous pre- and post-punk bands like Television and Mission of Burma. Everybody just hated us, says Dave. The dogmatic hardcore scene didn't take too well to outside influences except for reggae, and Dane Bramage couldn't get many gigs because they weren't on the DC-based indie Discord label, which was co-founded by Ian MacKaye of Minor Threat and later Fugazi, and was then the only game in town for hardcore bands. As a joke, Dave originally put Bonham's 3-circle logo on the front of his bass drum. Later on, he got the logo tattooed on his arm, then variations of it on his wrist, and then his other arm. He also got a homemade tattoo of the Black Flag logo on his forearm that he made when he was 13. Dave had long admired a local DC hardcore band called Scream, who had already put out several records on Discord, and then he saw an ad in the local music paper saying that Scream was looking for a drummer. I thought I'd try out just to tell my friends that I jam with Scream, Dave says. He called, but the band never called him back because he was too young, and he had told them he was 19, even though he was really 16. Finally, Dave wangled an audition, and after jamming a few times, Scream asked Dave to join the band. Dave said he was committed to Dane Bramage, but a couple of months later he got back in touch with them and convinced them to take him on. Dave dropped out of high school late in his junior year. I was 17 and extremely anxious to see the world and play. So I did, Dave says. I'm totally glad I did it. Dave plans to go to college someday, though. Well, we all know that never happened. Much later, when Wendy Cobain met Virginia Grohl in New York for Nirvana's Saturday Night Live appearance, they compared notes on their sons. We were just amazed at how much these two kids are alike, says Wendy. They're like twins that got separated somehow. I don't see that at all, Dave says at first. Then he adds, in some ways I can, because I remember the first time I went into the house where Kurt grew up, and we went upstairs where his room was, and there was stuff written on the walls. The brain with a little question mark. And I remember being stoned and drawing a little brain with a question mark in it in like 7th or 8th grade. When I saw that, I thought it was kind of strange. And we're both total slobs. Dave was supposed to go to night school, but he spent the tuition money on pot instead. He rehearsed with Scream for 6 months, and then the band went on a 2-month U.S. tour in October of 1987. Touring with Scream was so much fun. It was a lesson in life, says Dave. Learning to budget yourself on several dollars a day. You had 3 meals, or 2, and you have to somehow save up money or ask for the next 3 days per diem if you want to buy pot. You can't buy cigarettes more than 3 times a week. If you do, you have to buy bargain brand. I'd never seen the country before, and everything was just so fucking punk. Dave became a big Melvins fan after seeing them open for hardcore bands in DC, when he read in Maximum Rock and Roll that they had reformed after a brief breakup, Scream was on tour in Memphis, Dave had bought an Elvis postcard and happened to get Elvis's uncle Vester Presley to sign it. He sent it to the Melvins in San Francisco and asked if they'd come to Scream's show there. The night before the gig, Dave found out that Scream and the Melvins were on the same bill. Dave befriended the Melvins, and they swapped addresses and have corresponded ever since. Well, yeah, Buzz Osborne is the one who introduced Dave to Kurt and Chris, but we'll get there. Back in San Francisco for another tour, Dave went backstage after a Melvins gig where Kurt and Chris were hanging out. They were in town to rehearse with Dale Crover for the 1990 West Coast tour with Sonic Youth. I remember Kurt sitting in this chair looking pissed, Dave recalls, while Chris was being exceptionally loud and boisterous. "Who is that guy?" Dave asked Osborne. He didn't wind up speaking to either of them. During one of their forays down to LA to meet the labels, Kurt and Chris stopped in San Francisco to hang out with the Melvins, who told them there was a great hardcore band playing at the I-Beam called Scream. They went and were promptly knocked out by their drummer. God, what a great drummer, Chris thought. Wish he'd be in our band. Dave recorded 1 studio and 2 live albums with Scream, who blossomed into one of America's most explosive hardcore bands and toured the US and Europe until the middle of September 1990, when girlfriend trouble compelled bass player Skeeter to leave the tour suddenly. Stranded in Los Angeles with no money, Dave called his friend Buzz Osborne. Now, before we proceed with that, Buzz tells a story of how Scream broke up, and it wasn't girlfriend trouble. It was, okay, Skeeter, the bassist, had a 2-year-old with his girlfriend. But Skeeter toured so much the first 2 years of this kid's life that the kid didn't even know him. When Skeeter came home, the kid was like creeped out by him, like a friend. You know how kids are. If you don't spend a lot of time with them, they don't trust you. They don't want to be near you. And he said, "Man, I gotta quit the band. My own kid doesn't even know me." That's how Buzz Osborne explains the Scream breakup and the reason why Dave went to Nirvana. But let us continue. Osborne knew Kurt and Chris loved Dave's drumming and called Chris to tell him he'd given Dave his number. When Dave called, Chris was ecstatic, but he felt obligated to at least ask Dave a few questions before going any further. He was into the right bands, and Chris invited him up to Seattle. Dave had heard Nirvana for the first time during one of Scream's frequent European tours. "You look at the cover of Bleach," he says, "and you just think they're these big burly unshaven lager drinking guys. They look kind of nasty on the front, almost like a metal band, but with this retarded weirdness about them." He thought they sounded a bit like the Melvins, which was okay by him. Dave took apart his drums, fit all the pieces into one big cardboard box, and flew up to Seattle with only a bag of clothes. Kurt and Chris picked him up at SeaTac Airport and began the drive to Tacoma. To break the ice, Dave offered Kurt an apple. "No thanks," Kurt replied. "It'll make my teeth bleed." That wasn't the first awkward moment they had had. On the phone with Kurt before he headed up to Seattle, Dave mentioned a party he had gone to after a Scream show in Olympia. The band bought a bunch of beer, and the great disco music spilling out onto the street augured well for a happening bash. They arrived at the apartment to find about 20 people, with all the guys on one side of the room and all the girls on another. They were total Olympia hot chocolate party Hello Kitty people, says Dave. The band stood around drinking beer and feeling awkward until suddenly someone turned off the stereo. This girl comes in and sits down and plugs in this guitar and starts playing this total bad teen suicide awful music. "Boys, boys, bad, die," Dave says. And after every song, everyone would clap, and we were like, let's get out of here. Dave had just begun insulting the sad little girl with the bad fucking songs when Kurt said, "That's my girlfriend, Toby." Kurt was actually at the party and remembers that the members of Scream were making fun of everybody there. "They were real rocker dudes," says Kurt. "I hated them. I thought they were assholes." Kurt remembers Dave in particular. He brought up this Primus tape from their car and tried to play it, and everyone got mad at him. Primus is awesome, dude. If you're not down with Primus, you're not down with fucking American Spy Fox, alright? Les Claypool's a badass. The Motorsports Gig happened to be the night after Dave arrived. He was stunned by the size and enthusiasm of the crowd. The only other local show he'd seen that big was Fugazi in DC. In Seattle, punk rock had become big business. It seemed like a local punk scene gone bad in a way, says Dave. I saw the Nirvana t-shirt stand. Every fucking kid and their brother buying the crack smoking, fudge packing, kitty petting, St. Horseman motherfucker t-shirt, which I also had in 8th grade, by the way, and I've told you guys this story. I tried to wear it into the U.S. Capitol building, and they made me turn it inside out. In a fucking country that says they allow for freedom of thought and speech, they made me turn my shirt inside out. It seemed like a local punk scene gone bad. Oh, nope. They must have sold 200 t-shirts that night. That's insane for a local punk rock show. Yes, that really is. I didn't know what I was getting myself into at all. Dave was not terribly impressed by Nirvana. I thought they were all right, he says. They didn't completely blow me away. The Melvins played before them, and I was so into the Melvins that I was spent by the time Nirvana went on. Still, the material seemed fun to play, and besides, although Dave thought Danny Peters was a fucking incredible drummer, he didn't think Nirvana sounded quite right with Peters. The Motorsports show that Dave came to was the show that Dan Peters from Mudhoney stepped in. And remember, Dan Peters also did the Sliver recording, the audio recording with Nirvana, but then Dave would appear in the Sliver video. That's why you see the Mudhoney poster behind Dave. It's a shout out to Dan Peters, because Dave is actually pretending to play drums to Dan Peters' recording. Okay, so still the material seemed fun to play, and besides, although Dave thought Danny Peters was a fucking incredible drummer, he didn't think Nirvana sounded quite right with Peters. He was probably right. Peters is an excellent hard-hitting drummer, but doesn't play in the heavy Bonham Squay style that Nirvana requires. Peters played well at the Motorsports show, but he didn't quite fit. It was like a man wearing a very nice hat that nevertheless didn't go with his suit. Dave stayed with Krist and Shelley at first. The day after the Motorsports show, Krist and Shelley threw a barbecue, during which Krist, Kurt, and Danny Peters did an interview for a cover story in the now-defunct English music weekly, Sounds. Man, I wish we still had magazines like that. No one was to know they were auditioning a new drummer. A few days later, Kurt and Krist auditioned Dave at the Dutchman. We knew in 2 minutes that he was the right drummer, says Krist. He was a hard hitter. He was really dynamic. He was so bright, so hot, so vital. He fucking rocked. Dave was steady, solid, tasteful, and definitely a hard hitter. When he played a roll on his snare, it sounded like the powerful chop of spinning helicopter blades. When he pounded on his gigantic tom-toms, they didn't make a tone so much as they exploded like rifle shots. His outsized cymbals fluttered like punching bags under his attack. Dave could also sing, giving the band the potential for live harmonies for the first time. Then there was the delicate matter of telling Danny Peters that he was out of the band after only a few weeks. During an acoustic appearance on Calvin Johnson's KAOS radio show a few days later, Chaos Radio, Kurt revealed that they had a new drummer and that he hadn't even broken the news to Peters yet. "Who's the new drummer?" Johnson asked. "His name is Dave, and he's a baby Dale Crover," Kurt answered. "He plays almost as good as Dale, and within a few years' practice, he may even give him a run for his money." Kurt acknowledged the awkward situation with Peters. "Dan's such a beautiful guy and such a beautiful drummer," he said, "but you can't pass up on an opportunity to play with the drummer of our dreams, which is Dave. He's been the drummer of our dreams for like 2 years. It's a bummer. A big bummer." A tour of England had been planned. Kurt called me up, says Peters, and he said he thought they were going to go with Geffen, and I'm like, cool. Then I go, "So what about this tour?" And he goes, well, we got another drummer. And I wasn't bummed out at all. I kind of half-ass expected it, and I was like, oh, that's cool. I wasn't sure how they were feeling because their communication skills at that time were kind of not happening. I wasn't bummed at all. I'm still not bummed. Later, he would say that he was very bummed about it. I mean, I don't think he was mad at Kurt and Krist. I think he realized, like, sometimes you're just not the right drummer. You're just not. Like, I've auditioned for different bands, and I've been accepted in the bands that I didn't feel I was right for that band, but for some reason they felt I was right for their band. And then there were bands that I really felt I was right for who didn't think I was right for them. And it's just weird. It's chemistry and how you play, and you just should not take it personally. If you ever audition for any bands or anything, if someone turns you down, don't let that stop you, because the next person might say you're fucking brilliant. As Chris points out, if he was going to join our band, that would be the end of Mudhoney, and we loved Mudhoney so much, we didn't want to be responsible for that. Dave suits them way better than I did, Peters admits. He really does. To me, that's more important too. He's got the heavy shit right there. He beats the fuck out of those drums. They definitely got the person that suited them better. Peters went on to a short stint with Screaming Trees, then Mudhoney reformed and eventually signed with Warner's in 1992. Peters says he's having a great time with Mudhoney, one of America's greatest rock and roll bands. The only thing is, he says, Nirvana put out one fucking killer record, and I sure would have liked to have played on it. Meanwhile, Scream dissolved and the guitarist and the singer, brothers Franz and Peter Stahl, later formed Wool. In the summer of 1993, Dave joined Skeeter and the Stalls for a triumphant Scream reunion tour. Kurt and Krist had found a rehearsal space in Tacoma, a converted barn. It had brown shag carpet and a massive PA that made a loud hissing sound. They shared it with a slick bar band, students from the Guitar Institute of Technology, by Krist's guess. Dave stayed with Krist and Shelley for a month, then moved in with Kurt in Olympia. The Cobain Grohl house was knee-deep in corn dog sticks. It was the most filthy pigsty I'd ever lived in, says Kurt, and that's saying a lot. Remember the terrariums in the house in Aberdeen where him and Matt Lukin stayed, and they had the turtle shit that drained into the floorboards? Well, it would drain under the house, but then when it rained, it would come up into and soak into the floorboards. So if Kurt says this place was disgusting, it was probably pretty damn disgusting. They needed a woman around or something, I don't know. They passed the time by shooting a BB gun, occasionally scoring a direct hit on the windows of the state lottery building across the street. Dave describes the apartment as small, cluttered, dirty, smelly. 6-foot-tall Dave slept on a 5-foot couch. He slept in the same room as Kurt's tank, and the clicking of the turtle shells against the glass as they tried to escape would keep him up at night. It just felt so weird, says Dave. The last 2.5 years have been pretty weird. Okay, so I guess Kurt kept his turtles all that time. And I guess apparently the turtles moved with Kurt wherever he went. There wasn't a lot to do, Dave continues. There was a lot of time just spent sitting in the room, totally silent, reading, or just totally silent doing nothing. Staring at walls, or going downtown and seeing a 99-cent movie, or shooting BB guns in the backyard. Kurt and Dave began going to sleep at 6 in the morning as the sun was coming up, and waking as the sun was going down. Never seeing sunlight. The two barely spoke. The conversation rarely got past, "Are you hungry?" "Yes." I find that really hard to believe. I could see Kurt being totally content, just like not talking and playing his guitar and painting, and he did like dioramas, and like he was into all kinds of shit, sculpting. But Dave seems like the kind of guy, kind of charismatic, happy-go-lucky. It seemed to me like Dave would try to get Kurt to talk. Like he would get bored and be like egging Kurt on to talk. But maybe because they just met and he was just joining this band and he knew that he was joining a really fucking good band and they were going on this European tour soon and all that. Maybe he thought I should just keep my mouth shut and be happy that I'm here. Still, Kurt became more social after Dave moved in. Kurt sort of came out of his shell, says Slim Moon. He was around more. He seemed happier with his life. He was hanging out with actual Olympians. Being around so many artistic people seemed to have an energizing, inspiring effect on Kurt. In Olympia, he could express himself without inhibition or fear of rejection. As a highly creative person, Kurt yearned to be around other creative people. In Olympia, he appreciated that he was appreciated. Kurt had been going out with Toby Vale since before Dave moved in. She was a couple of years younger than Kurt and had no intention of settling into a long-term relationship. I was definitely looking for somebody I could spend quite a few years with, Kurt says, even though he was only 23 at the time. I wanted that security, and I knew that it wasn't going to be with her. So I was just wasting my time, and I just felt bad about it. By late 1990, that fact was becoming painfully apparent, and that's when Kurt says he broke up with Toby. We've talked about Toby and Kurt's relationship in other videos. I do believe that this book will go on to describe their relationship. Notice how Kurt said, I wanted something long term, I wanted security, but I wasn't going to get that with Toby. That's just because at that point in Toby's life, she did not want to settle down. She wanted to have open relationships. That's as blunt as I can make it. He was just a wreck, says Dave, just a mess. But Kurt insists that it wasn't strictly because of Toby. It was just that I was tired of my life, basically, he says. I was tired of living in Olympia with nothing to do. All during the time that Tracy and I were breaking up, I wanted to move to Seattle. I knew that I was long overdue for a change. I didn't have any extreme thing I could do to just get out of it right away. It wasn't like all the other times where I could have a fight with somebody and get kicked out of their house and have no choice but to do something else. I was just tired of not finding the right mate, Kurt says. I'd been looking my whole life. I just got tired of trying to have a girlfriend that I knew that I wouldn't eventually spend more than a couple of months with. I've always been old-fashioned in that respect. I've always wanted a girlfriend that I could have a good relationship with for a very long time. I wish I was capable of just playing the field, but I always wanted more than that. The rides in the van to Tacoma for practice had already been quite enough. But then Kurt stopped talking completely. Finally, after weeks and weeks of this, they were driving home from practice one night when Kurt broke the silence by saying, I'm not always like this, adding that he would eventually recover from the breakup. I just kind of said, oh, that's cool, Dave says, but I was thinking to myself, oh, thank God. They practiced from 10 o'clock to 1 in the morning almost every night over a 4 or 5 month period. The band's chemistry was quickly falling into place. We felt like we could do whatever we wanted to do, Dave says. There weren't any restrictions, and it got weird and jammy, and we'd do these noisy new wave noise experimental jam things. We'd always start off the practice just jamming. We'd set up and plug in and jam for 20 minutes on nothing at all. I fucking love jamming, dude. Like, anybody who's ever played in a band knows what jamming is. That's when you come up with your most creative, craziest shit, is when you're just jamming. There weren't any restrictions, and it got weird and jammy. We'd always start off practice just jamming. We'd set up and plug in and jam for 20 minutes on nothing at all. Out of the jams sprang countless songs, but they'd soon forget them or lose the tapes they recorded them on. There were probably 30 or 40 songs we had written that are just gone, Dave says. The same day Kurt Cobain's body was found, Courtney Love called Eric Erlandson and very specifically told Eric to go to the house and retrieve the cassette tapes. There are over 100, let me say that correctly without my redneck slang. There are over 100 cassette tapes, I believe at 122 in all. Kurt Cobain's recordings, new songs, songs he never released, stuff he was working on. Very few people have ever heard them. Courtney, Eric, and whoever they decided could hear them, heard them. But yeah, think about that. Courtney Love finds out her husband was found dead. And the first thing she did was called Eric Erlandson and said, go retrieve all of Kurt's recordings. After a few weeks, Dave played his first show with Nirvana at the North Shore Surf Club in Olympia. The show had sold out on one day's notice, and Dave was so amazed that he called his mother and sister about it. They opened with a cover of the Vaseline's Son of a Gun. Or at least they tried to. They blew a circuit twice before someone realized all the amps were on one line. It was a frenzied show. Dave played with such force that he broke his snare drum. Let me tell you, Breaking a snare drum is not easy. If you're playing like double ply rock snare heads, those things are pretty thick. So to break a snare drum, well, I guess if it was an old drum head, that would make sense. And it probably was, seeing how he was just a poor guy at this point in time. I picked it up and held it in front of the audience to show them that we have a new drummer who's very good, says Kurt. Kurt and Chris knew, and everybody else knew who saw them play, that they were only a hint of what they could be until Dave joined the band, says Slim Moon. He just knew how to play drums and he understood their music. Chad just never got it, and the guys before Chad never really got it. Danny was a great drummer, but he just wasn't right. Then they went over to Europe for a tour with LA rockers L7, ostensibly to promote the Sliver Dive single, which didn't actually come out until a month after they left Europe. Again, poor management by Sub Pop. You want to be touring as your record is available. People see you live, they think, oh wow, what a great band, I want to listen to this at home, and they buy the record, right? You sell the records at your shows too. God, Sub Pop really didn't know what the hell they were doing. And they still ended up millionaires thanks to all those talented Seattle guys. At London's Heathrow Airport, they met tour manager Alex McLeod. McLeod and Dave had met on a Scream tour, and they hadn't exactly hit it off. The working papers for the tour listed Danny Peters as Nirvana's drummer, so McLeod was surprised to see Dave coming through customs at the airport. Oh, fuck, thought Dave. Oh, fuck, thought McLeod. But they quickly made amends, partly out of necessity and partly because they shared an appreciation for what McLeod calls inane, senseless humor. Along for the ride were soundman Greg Montgomery, monitor man Ian Beveridge, and a lot of equipment. They also had a VCR and 2 tapes, a Monty Python episode and Spinal Tap, which had long since become standard equipment on any tour bus. So that's cool. At this time they got a bus. When Dave first goes to Europe with Nirvana, they got a bus and they have a TV and a VCR in the bus so they can watch movies. They played to pack houses of about 1,000 people a night, winning rave reviews from the all-important UK music weeklies. Kurt, only half sarcastically, told Keith Cameron in the October 27th Sounds, "I don't want to have any other kind of job. I can't work among people. I may as well try and make a career out of this. All my life, my dream has been to be a big rock star. Just may as well abuse it while you can." He added that the band was exploring a more pop style of songwriting. "We figured we may as well get on the radio and try and make a little bit of money out of it." Nirvana's UK publicist, Anton Brooks, recalls that Kurt was very confident that he would soon realize his dream. "I remember Kurt saying that the album was going to go top 10 and there were these tracks that were going to be massive as singles." Brooks says you could see in his face that he totally believed that. He knew it. Was Kurt Cobain such a musical genius that he knew his songs were going to go to the top of the charts? It makes you wonder, did Kurt Cobain, because Kurt says when he made Bleach, he purposefully made it sound the way it does. He wrote songs that fit Sub Pop's sort of this genre they had created, grunge. And then he decided, I need to make some money. I want to make a career out of this. So then he writes, Smells Like Teen Spirit, In Bloom, Lithium. Did this guy, it's like he knew something that everybody else didn't.